Now, let's get comfortable and drift into deep, peaceful sleep together. Rain pressed against the apartment windows with the patience of something that had learned to wait. Not the bright, percussive rain of summer storms, but the slow, deliberate rain of late autumn, the kind that didn't announce itself so much as accumulate, building in quiet layers against the glass until the sound became indistinguishable from the building's own breathing. The city outside had gone soft and colourless, streetlights reduced to smeared orange impressions, the sidewalk below holding shallow black mirrors that trembled whenever a car passed. Nadia Voss stood at the window for a moment before pulling the curtains closed, and in that moment she felt the specific loneliness of watching weather from inside a room that doesn't belong to you. The apartment was a rental, which meant it had the quality of a space that had absorbed other people's lives without quite releasing them. The walls were off-white in the way that suggested they'd been repainted over a previous off-white, and, before that, another shade nobody had bothered to name. The carpet in the hallway ran from the front door to the bedroom in a tired brownish grey that held the ghost shapes of furniture arrangements the current tenant hadn't chosen. Tonight the carpet was faintly damp near the front door where rain had blown under the gap, and the smell it gave off, wet fibre, old rubber, the heat of a building working too hard against the cold, was the kind of smell that settled in the back of your throat and stayed there. Nadia had been in the apartment for 11 months, long enough to know which floorboards sang under weight, which faucet ran cold before it ran hot, which corner of the bathroom ceiling bloomed a faint brown stain after heavy rain. Not long enough to call it home in any way that felt true. She kept her things neatly arranged in ways that looked temporary, books stacked rather than shelved, a suitcase visible in the closet instead of hidden, her coffee mugs in a cluster at the front of the cabinet as if ready to be packed quickly. She'd moved here after Marcus, which was how she thought of it, not after the breakup or after the apartment on Crestfield, just after Marcus, as if his name were a geographic location she'd evacuated. She moved through her bedtime routine now with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned to treat ritual as medicine. She washed her face in the bathroom, watched the water run cold, then warm, patted her skin dry with a towel that smelled of the lavender detergent she bought specifically because the smell was supposed to calm the nervous system. She had read this in 3 separate places and had decided to believe it the way you decide to believe things that are harmless to believe. She brushed her teeth standing slightly sideways, not looking directly at the mirror, which was a habit she'd developed without meaning to, and had never examined too closely. She took her phone off the bathroom shelf and set it face down. On the bedroom nightstand, which was the last step in what she privately called closing the channels, the act of making herself unreachable so that she could, in theory, rest. The bedroom was dark except for the clock on the nightstand, which glowed a low, undemanding green, and the thin line of orange streetlight that pressed under the curtains. The rain had softened everything. The distant traffic, the plumbing in the walls, the occasional creak of the building adjusting its weight, into a kind of auditory padding that should have felt safe. Usually it did feel safe. Tonight it felt like padding inside a box. She stood at the side of the bed and looked at it with the expression of someone reviewing a contract they'd already signed. The sheets were clean, she'd changed them 4 days ago, but 4 days felt like long enough to justify the thought of something fresher. This was Nadia's specific brand of sleep anxiety, the conviction that the physical environment needed to achieve some precise quality of cleanness, coolness and order before her body would permit unconsciousness. The therapist she'd seen briefly after Marcus had called it hypervigilance, which was a clinical word for the feeling that if she let down her guard for one moment something would slip through. The therapist had also suggested that the excessive sheet changing and pillow flipping and window checking and curtain adjusting were ways of enacting control in a space that felt fundamentally uncertain. Nadia had agreed with this assessment and then continued doing all of those things, because understanding a behaviour and stopping it are related in theory and completely separate in practice. She decided on the pillowcase, not the full sheet change, as that felt excessive, and she was already tired in the specific hollow way that comes from a day of suppressing things. But the pillowcase, which was the part that pressed directly against the face, and if you were going to be deliberate about anything, the part that pressed against the face seemed like the right place to start. The linen closet was in the hallway, between the bathroom and the bedroom, a narrow door that opened inward and was easy to overlook because it was painted the same off-white as the surrounding wall and had a handle so small it looked like an afterthought. Nadia pulled it open and reached for the light inside, a bare bulb on a pull string that threw a hard, unglamorous light on the folded contents of the shelves. She had organised the closet when she moved in, something the previous tenant apparently hadn't done, or had done and then abandoned. The shelves held her linens in stacked rectangles, fitted sheets with their awkward folded corners, flat sheets, pillowcases, 2 extra blankets in compression bags, a spare set of towels. The whole thing smelled of the lavender detergent, and beneath that something older, a building smell, a history smell, the neutral ghost of other people's clean laundry. The air inside the closet was slightly cooler than the hallway, which she had always attributed to the fact that the closet shared an exterior wall, though she had never verified this. She found a pillowcase on the second shelf, unfolded the top one from its neat stack, and stood for a moment in the hallway light holding it between both hands with the small satisfaction of someone who has accomplished the preparatory step of a larger plan. That was when she felt the warmth. It was subtle enough that her first instinct was to dismiss it, to file it under the category of sensory noise that tired people misinterpret, because tired people are unreliable witnesses to their own experience. But it didn't fade the way a misreading should. It stayed, a temperature in the fabric that was too present to be ambient, too specific to be the warmth of the closet air. Not heat, not anything so declarative. Warmth, the kind that belongs to something living. The fabric held it the way cloth holds the impression of a body that has just risen from it, the ghost warmth of recent occupancy, except that no one had slept in this pillowcase. It had been folded on the shelf for 4 days. Nadia stood in the hallway holding the pillowcase and told herself the obvious things. She was tired. The building's old heating system ran warm sometimes and didn't distribute evenly. She had just been standing near the radiator in the bathroom. None of these explanations felt quite right in the way that none of them felt quite wrong, which is the most unsettling kind of explanation. She shifted the fabric between her hands, testing the warmth, mapping where it was strongest. It seemed strongest at the centre, which was where the folded fabric was thickest, which suggested an internal source rather than a surface one, which was not a thought she chose to complete. Behind her, the closet door clicked shut. She turned. The door was closed. Not swinging, closed, as if it had been pulled by a hand and released at the exact angle that produced a latch. She looked at it for 3 full seconds. Old hinges, she thought. Building shifts. The rain changes pressure systems. Pressure systems move air. Moving air in an old building does things to doors that aren't level in their frames. And every door in this apartment was at least slightly off level in its frame because the building had been settling for 60 years and would presumably continue settling until one of them gave out first. This was the explanation, and it was a good one, and she chose it. She carried the pillowcase into the bedroom. She changed the pillowcase standing beside the bed, pulling the old one off first and folding it over the footboard because she was too tired to walk it to the hamper immediately. The new one went on with the tight, tucked efficiency of someone who has done this enough times that her hands worked without being told. She smoothed it flat against the pillow with both palms, pressing out the wrinkles, feeling the cotton settle against the filling. The warmth had faded, she decided, or she'd stopped noticing it. Both of these outcomes were acceptable. She got into bed. The rain had not softened. If anything, it had deepened, developing a texture, a kind of granular quality that made it sound like something being slowly poured. The curtains moved once with no apparent cause, a single slow billow toward the centre of the room, as if the window had exhaled and then settled again. The plumbing knocked twice in the wall, the building's standard nocturnal conversation with itself, and went quiet. Nadia lay on her back with her arms at her sides in the posture of someone trying to be a good patient, waiting for the sleep she had earned by following all the correct steps. She'd had a terrible day. Not terrible in any single identifiable way, which was the specific kind of terrible she'd learned was hardest to carry because it gave you nothing to point at. She had spoken to her mother in the morning, a call that lasted 19 minutes and covered practical things, a dentist appointment, a question about a package, a brief exchange about the weather in the city where her mother lived, and that had left Nadia with the customary feeling of having stood very close to something she wanted to say, and having walked away from it instead. Her mother had asked, toward the end of the call, in the tone of someone asking about the weather, whether Nadia was seeing anyone. Nadia had said no. Her mother had said in the specific way she had that contained an entire editorial without using any additional words, and then changed the subject. Nadia had let her. Nadia had done what she always did, which was let the moment close over the thing that wanted to be said, like water closing over a dropped stone. At work, she had spent 4 hours in a meeting about a project she had strong opinions about, and had offered exactly none of them because the meeting had gone in, a direction that made offering opinions feel dangerous in ways she couldn't fully articulate, and so she had said nothing, and had watched the project get shaped into something she disagreed with, and had left the meeting feeling as though she'd been filled with concrete. Her colleague Dev had stopped her in the hallway afterward and said quietly, "You seemed quiet in there," and Nadia had said, "I'm just tired," which was true, and which was also the most efficient way she knew to close a door without slamming it. She'd come home on the train, standing for 20 minutes pressed between strangers in the specific, impersonal intimacy of public transit, and had spent the entire ride composing in her head a text message to her friend Sable that she had not sent. The message had gone through various drafts, starting elaborately confessional, moving to something wry and indirect, arriving finally at something brief and precise, and she had not sent any of them because by the time she was home the moment for sending felt past, which was a fiction she often told herself to avoid the risk of saying the real thing. She had eaten dinner standing at the counter. She had watched 20 minutes of a television show without retaining any of it. She had stood at the window and watched the rain, and now she lay in the dark with all of this inside her, with the day's unsaid things arranged in their familiar positions, the way you arrange furniture you've stopped noticing, and tried to let the rain do what rain was supposed to do, which was absorb the surplus, carry things away, make the world feel rinsed and forgivable. The pillow was very comfortable. This was the first thing she noticed, the specific quality of the comfort, which was more complete than she expected. The pillow held her head with a yielding precision that felt, not designed exactly, but attentive, responsive, as if the filling had already calibrated itself to the exact weight and angle of her skull, which was, she told herself, exactly what a good pillow did, which was why she'd bought this particular pillow, which had cost slightly more than she was comfortable spending on a pillow, and had felt like an adult decision at the time. She exhaled, and felt, faintly, at the edges of perception, where you couldn't be sure if you were noticing something or inventing it, the pillow give a little more than it had. Not dramatically, not in any way that would be visible to another person in the room, just a small additional concession of resistance, as if the exhale had been taken as a signal, an invitation to accommodate more deeply. She inhaled, and the pillow held. She exhaled, and it gave. Gave specifically, she thought, in the way that things give when they are learning you. She turned onto her side. The ceiling was dark above the place where she'd been lying. The clock read 11:47 in its quiet green numerals. She fixed her eyes on the curtains and listened to the rain and tried the standard techniques, breathing slowly, releasing tension from her feet upward, letting her thoughts pass like clouds, all the things the sleep hygiene articles recommended, all the things that sometimes worked and sometimes felt like trying to convince a door to open by politely describing the door. She was almost there. She could feel the edge of it, the slight blurring of thought that meant the threshold was close, when her cheek registered something, a texture. Not the texture of the pillowcase itself, not the smooth, faint weave she'd felt while smoothing it flat an hour ago. Something else, something that existed at the surface of the cotton as an additional quality, a relief pattern pressed so lightly into the fabric that it wouldn't have been detectable if her face hadn't been pressed directly against it. She shifted her cheek slightly, the way you'd move a hand over a surface to verify what your fingers were telling you. The texture moved with her, not quickly, not dramatically. The slow, unhurried movement of something adjusting its position, the way words shift when you move your eye to a different part of the page. Except she wasn't reading. She was lying in the dark with her face against a pillowcase, and beneath her cheek there were shapes that felt like letters, felt like the raised impressions of handwriting pressed into the cotton from below, felt like the ghost of words that had been absorbed into the fabric and were now pressing gently back toward the surface, looking for the side of a face to read against. She brought her hand up and felt the pillowcase with her fingertips. The texture was there. She wasn't imagining it. She could feel it clearly through the pads of her fingers, the little raised ridges and impressions that formed patterns she couldn't quite organize into meaning. Almost letters, almost language. The suggestion of an alphabet arranged in ways that might be words if she could just get enough light, get her fingers to cooperate, get the shapes to hold still long enough to be read. She sat up. She sat up sharply, not from panic. Panic was too hot for what she felt, which was something cooler and more awake than panic, but from the specific alertness that comes from feeling your environment behave in a way it shouldn't. She sat with her back against the headboard and her knees drawn up and looked at the pillow in the dark. It looked like a pillow. It looked exactly like a pillow. In the clock's green, tinted dimness, it was simply a rectangle of fabric-covered filling in the middle of a bed. Completely ordinary, completely still. She reached out and pressed one hand flat against the pillowcase. The warmth was back, more than before. No longer the subtle, ambiguous warmth of the closet. This was specific, warm in the way that a body is warm. Warm with an internal quality that suggested generation rather than retention. The fabric under her palm felt close to skin temperature, felt alive in the way that things feel alive when they're taking in and putting out, when they are metabolizing. And beneath the warmth, beneath the surface warmth, she could feel the texture again, more pronounced now, the letter shapes more defined, as if whatever was pressing them up from inside the pillow had been encouraged by her earlier touch, and was making a greater effort. Nadia took her hand away. She sat in the dark for what might have been 2 minutes, or might have been 7, and listened to the rain, and thought about the explanation she had chosen earlier, the one about old hinges and pressure systems and tired people misinterpreting sensory information, and found that the explanation, while still technically available, had lost its structural integrity. Had the feeling of a story you tell yourself that you've told so many times the words have gone thin. She looked at the closet door from where she sat. It was closed. She couldn't remember whether she'd left it open or closed when she came back to the bedroom. She thought open. She usually left it open, the closet door, not the linen closet, the bedroom closet, though now she was uncertain which one she was thinking about, her brain having briefly confused the two in the way that tired brains misfile related categories. The bedroom closet door was closed, and she was fairly certain she'd left it open, but fairly certain was not certain, and she had bigger questions at the moment, and she set this one aside. She looked at the pillowcase. The building's tenants had stories. This was a thing she knew in the incidental way that you absorb the mythology of a place, from half-heard hallway conversations, from the building's unofficial historian, a retired postal worker named Geraldine who lived on the 3rd floor and who offered unprompted context about the building, the way some people offered unsolicited opinions as a kind of compulsion. Geraldine had told her about the family in 4B who had vacated without notice, in the middle of the night, about the water damage in 1990 that had never quite been fully remediated, about the man on the 7th floor who had lived there for 30 years and had been found by neighbours after 3 days, and whose apartment had taken months to be rented again because of something Geraldine described as a heaviness that people felt when they walked in. And she had told Nadia, early in Nadia's tenancy, over coffee in Geraldine's apartment on a Sunday afternoon, with the careful, interested neutrality of someone who believed completely in what they were saying, but understood that not everyone would receive it well. She had told Nadia about Mufflewick. She had used that word, Mufflewick, with the specificity of a proper noun, a name. She had said it the way you say the name of a person you know personally, with the familiarity of long acquaintance, and without the hesitation that usually accompanies the introduction of something supernatural to a new listener. Mufflewick, she'd said, lives in the soft places, in the linen, in the pillows and the folded things. She'd held her coffee mug in both hands and looked at Nadia with the expression of a person delivering practical information, not attempting to frighten, just inform, the way you'd tell someone which shelf in the shared laundry room not to use. Mufflewick, Geraldine said, is interested in what people keep back, what they decide not to say. It lives in fabric because fabric holds things. Warmth, shape, smell. And if fabric can hold those, it can hold words too. The words you didn't speak. The true things you kept inside because saying them felt too dangerous, or too late, or too much. Nadia had smiled and drunk her coffee, and had filed this under the category of charming building mythology. The kind of local colour that made a place feel storied and old. The kind of thing you recalled at dinner parties when someone asked whether you'd encountered anything interesting in the city. She'd not thought about it seriously, in the way that you don't think seriously about a thing that doesn't have a context to fit into yet. It had a context now. She was sitting in her bed at 11:54 p.m. with a pillow that was warm in the wrong way, and a pillowcase that had, under her hands and against her cheek, produced the texture of language, the physical impression of unsaid things pressing out toward the surface, and Geraldine's story had climbed out of the dinner party category and installed itself in the centre of her attention with the solidity of something that has always been true and was simply waiting for the right moment to become relevant. She got out of bed. She moved to the window first, not for any practical reason, but because the window felt like the right thing to move toward, because the rain was still falling beyond the curtains, and she wanted to be near it, wanted to be in the presence of something that was simply and uncomplicatedly itself, that was doing what it was supposed to do. She stood by the window with her arms crossed, the cool that leaked through the glass pressing gently against her face, and she listened to the rain fall on the city and thought about what she had swallowed today. The call with her mother. The 19 minutes during which she had stood in her kitchen with the phone against her ear and had heard the "ah" that wasn't just "ah," and had let it go by because engaging with it would have required saying something she'd been not saying for years, something about the way her mother's disappointment operated, about the specific quality of her mother's love which was always accompanied by a rider clause, a subliminal addendum, a pressure toward a version of Nadia that Nadia had never been and suspected she was not capable of becoming. You could spend an entire conversation with her mother speaking true sentences and never once say the true thing, and today, like every other day, Nadia had done exactly this. The meeting. Devs. Quiet observation in the hallway. The door she'd closed on it with "I'm just tired." The text message to Sable she had drafted and redrafted and not sent, which she could reconstruct now word for word, which began, "I think something is wrong with me that isn't fixable," and which she had not sent because she was afraid that Sable would agree. These were the things in the pillow. This was what it was warm with. She knew this with the certainty of a body knowledge that bypasses the skeptical faculty entirely, that doesn't wait to be argued into acceptance. The pillowcase had been absorbing the room, had been absorbing her, had been waiting with its particular quality of fabric patience for the thing she most reliably produced, which was restraint. Geraldine had said, "It loves the moment you choose quiet over honesty because quiet feels kinder. It feeds on that moment." On the practice swallow, the turned cheek. The sentence begun and then smoothly redirected into something safer. Nadia stood at the window for a long time. The city gleamed wetly below. The curtains moved in the sealed room draft that every old building generated around its own bones. Behind her, on the bed, the pillow sat in its pillowcase and was warm. She thought about what Geraldine had told her about the rule. There was always a rule in these building stories. There were things you were not supposed to do, and there was, usually, a counteraction, a procedure, something specific you could do to interrupt the thing while it was still interruptible. Geraldine had told her this part clearly, with the same practical delivery. If the pillow gets heavy, if it starts getting warm the wrong way, you sit up, you shake the pillowcase once. Once, she had emphasized, not twice, not several times once. And you silently release one unsaid thought into the rain. Not spoken, not whispered. Silent. You think the thing you've been not thinking, let it leave your body through the breathing and out into the rain sound, let the weather take it instead of the fabric. And you don't under any circumstances, Geraldine had said, lean into the pillow and whisper it. That was what it wanted. That was feeding it directly. She turned back from the window. The pillow had, she thought, gotten heavier. Not visibly. It still looked like a pillow on a bed, still maintained the correct geometry of a rectangular object resting on a flat surface. But it had a quality of presence that a pillow should not have, a gravitational quality, as if it were subtly more real than the things around it, as if reality were being very slowly concentrated in that piece of fabric. She crossed back to the bed. She sat on the edge, which put her thigh against the corner of the mattress, and her hands in her lap, and the pillow at her left. And she looked at it directly with the attention of someone who has decided to stop pretending not to notice something. The clock read 12:08 now. The rain had, if anything, intensified, pressing against the window glass with the steady patient pressure of something that had no reason to stop. She picked up the pillowcase. With both hands standing now, she lifted the pillow off the bed and held it in front of her, and pulled the pillowcase off with the firm, deliberate movements of someone removing a bandage. The pillowcase came off cleanly, the pillow itself falling back onto the bed with a sound that was too soft for what it felt like a heavier impact than a pillow falling onto a mattress should produce. The pillowcase hung from her two hands, and she could feel it. The warmth was concentrated there now, pooled at the bottom of the case where it had been folded against the seam, banked there like coals, like something being tended. She held the pillowcase out in front of her, both hands gripping the open end, and she snapped it once through the air. One clean motion, hard and deliberate, the crack of fabric finding its full extension, the snap that used to clear dust from something to establish its edges. The sound was sharp and brief, and it left a small silence in its wake. the way a sharp sound does, the way the room resets itself around a sudden noise. She felt the warmth leave, not gradually, not a slow fade. It left the fabric in one movement, as if released, as if the snap had been a seam giving way, and the pillowcase in her hands went to room temperature so quickly that the absence of warmth felt almost cold, felt like a sudden vacancy, a subtraction of something that had been filling the fabric to a pressure she hadn't fully registered until it was gone. She stood holding the empty pillowcase. Then she turned to the window. The rain pressed against the glass. The curtains hung still. She closed her eyes and did what she'd been told to do. She found the thought she'd been holding all day, found the one that had the most weight, the one that had been sitting at the base of her sternum since approximately 9 a.m. when her mother had said in the particular way, and she held the thought clearly in her mind without speaking it, without letting it reach her mouth, and she exhaled it into the rain sound. Let it leave through the breath. Let the breath carry it to the window, and the window carry it to the rain, and the rain carry it down to the street, and the street carry it wherever water goes when the storm is done. The thought was, I've been disappearing myself for years, and I don't know how to stop. She didn't say it. She didn't whisper it. She didn't breathe it into the pillow or confess it to the room or send it into the fabric that was built to hold. She gave it to the rain. The pillowcase in her hands had gone cool and ordinary. She turned it over, running her thumbs along the cotton surface, feeling for the letter shapes, the pressed impressions of language absorbed from the air around her. She couldn't find them. The fabric felt like fabric. The clean, neutral grain of cotton thread at a standard count, the small regularity of weave that had no additional information encoded in it. Just cloth. She put the pillowcase back on the pillow with hands that were not quite steady, not from fear, but from the concentration of someone doing something that requires precision. She smoothed it flat. She ran her palms over the surface the way you check the quality of your own work. It was cool. It was ordinary. The pillow sat on the bed and was simply a pillow. She got into bed. She lay on her back and listened to the rain, and thought about nothing in particular, which was itself unusual. Nadia's mind was not accustomed to resting in the nothing in particular, was more typically occupied with the drafting and revising of communication she wouldn't send, the rehearsal of conversation she wouldn't have, the storage of things in the tight interior spaces she had been building and reinforcing for years. But the rain was doing what rain was supposed to do, and the pillow was cool. Beneath her head, and the thought she'd been carrying since morning was somewhere in the water now, diluted past any particular meaning, and she felt for the first time in longer than she wanted to calculate the specific lightness of having put something down. She slept. The dream, if it was a dream, was of a room that looked like the room she was in but was not the room she was in, a room where the proportions were very slightly wrong, the ceiling fractionally too low, the walls a shade too close, as if the room had taken a single breath and held it. She was lying in the bed and the rain was falling, and the pillow beneath her head was warm, was very warm, was the temperature of a living thing pressed flat and instructed to be still, and she could feel against her cheek the raised impressions of words, could feel the full sentences this time, each letter distinct and legible, pressing up from inside the fabric with a new clarity, as if whatever was encoding them had grown bolder in the dark. She didn't read them in the dream. She was afraid to read them in the dream. She was afraid that if she turned her head and held the pillowcase up to the light, she would find there a library of everything she had ever chosen not to say, every sentence she had swallowed, every moment of chosen quiet over honest, difficult, necessary speech, and that the sight of it all assembled would be more than she wanted to know about herself. She woke at 3:17 a.m. The room was the correct proportions, the pillow was cool, the rain had thinned to a misting, the window glass beaded with it, the city outside running with quiet water. She lay still for a moment in the specific alertness of 3 a.m. waking, which is its own particular state, neither asleep nor fully reconstituted, the mind briefly visible to itself before the social machinery kicks in. She could still feel the ghost of the dream's raised letters against her cheek. She ran her fingers over the pillowcase and found nothing. Smooth. Cotton, the ordinary weave, no language encoded at the surface. She thought about what she hadn't sent to Sable. She thought about the meeting. She thought about her mother's... She thought about Marcus, which she usually saved for 3 a.m. because 3 a.m. was when the storage system's security was weakest and things found their way out regardless of whether they were invited. She thought about the last month with Marcus, the month during which she had been in the process of ending the relationship without telling him she was in the process of ending the relationship, the month she had spent in a state of interior certainty and exterior continuity, going through the motions of a relationship she had already evacuated internally while he was still fully present and trusting, and bewildered by the quality of her distance which he attributed to stress, to work, to the season, to anything except what it actually was. She had not told him she was leaving until she had finished leaving, and then the telling was retrospective, was a notification rather than a conversation, and the look on his face. She kept that look filed away in a place she didn't visit often, not because the memory was of her own pain, but because the memory was of the pain she had caused him by being incapable of saying the true thing before it was too late to matter. She had whispered that into a pillow once. Not this pillow, not this apartment. The apartment she'd shared with Marcus late in the last month, lying beside him while he slept and pressing her face into the pillow and whispering at the fabric, the confession she couldn't make to the room. "I am already gone. I just don't know how to tell you." She had thought that was a coping mechanism, the safe, private release. The words into the pillow so they don't have to go into the air where they'll be real. She understood now, lying in the dark of the correct room with the correctly proportioned ceiling, the rain misting against the glass. She understood that the whispering into the pillow was not release. The whispering into the pillow was storage. The words didn't go anywhere when you whispered them into fabric. They stayed. They accumulated. And whatever lived in the linen of buildings that had absorbed years of other people's accumulated silence, whatever had learned to eat what people grew in their private restraint, that was what found them. Not in the apartment with Marcus, maybe, but in a building like this one, in a linen closet with fabric warm in the wrong way, in a room that held its breath. She lay awake for an hour and let herself think the things she usually redirected. In the morning she would call Sable, she thought. She would send the message, or a version of it, the one that began with something true. She would find Dev at work and say, quietly, what she'd been unable to say in the meeting. These felt like plans she wouldn't keep, in the practiced way that 3 a.m. plans feel fragile and provisional in the morning light. But the feeling of having formulated them, the feeling of having let the thought reach its full shape inside her, without immediately packing it into a lower level of storage, this feeling was unexpectedly physical, was something she noticed in her chest, a kind of loosening, a hinge she hadn't known was tightened. The pillow was soft and cool beneath her head. She slept again, and the dream this time was of the city in the rain, and she was walking in it without an umbrella, the water running over her in clean sheets, the sidewalk gleaming, the streetlights blurred to orange roses in the wet. She was going somewhere. She wasn't sure where, but the direction felt clear, and the walking felt easy, and the rain was simply rain. Not a presence, not a listener, not a carrier of swallowed things, just water falling from the sky, in the way that water falls from the sky, because that is what water does. She woke at 7:22 a.m. to pale grey light behind the curtains. She lay, still for a moment as the dream drained away. The rain had stopped. The city outside was wet and quiet, the post-storm silence that fills a place after a long night of water, everything rinsed and settling. The clock read 7:22. The pillow beneath her head was the temperature of a pillow that has been slept on, warm with her own warmth, no more and no less. She stretched. She ran her hand over the pillowcase out of habit, checking, and found nothing but the grain of cotton, the ordinary close weave of fabric doing the simple thing that fabric does, holding its shape, taking the pressure of whatever rests against it without absorbing more than it was made to hold. The closet door was open. She was fairly certain she had not opened it in the night. She got up and stood in the hallway and looked at the linen closet for a long moment, at its narrow off-white door with the small afterthought of a handle. The door that had clicked shut at the precise moment she had first felt the warmth in. The pillowcase. She opened it. The bare bulb pulled on. The shelves held their stacked rectangles of clean folded linen, the compression bags with the blankets, the spare towels. The air inside was cool and smelled of lavender detergent, and beneath that the older building smell, the neutral history. She stood in the hallway and breathed it in. Then she turned and went to the kitchen to make coffee, walking over the faintly damp hallway carpet, the rain smell still in the fibres from the night before, but lightening now, going dry at the edges, the building slowly releasing the night's accumulated water, the way you slowly release a breath you've been holding too long. She filled the kettle. She opened the blinds. Outside, the city was wet and grey and ordinary and entirely itself. She made coffee and sat at the kitchen counter with her phone in her hand, and opened her message thread with Sable, and looked at the unsent draft she'd been carrying since yesterday. She read it once. "I think something is wrong with me that isn't fixable." She deleted "that isn't fixable" and typed instead, "and I've been not telling you about it." She sent it. She drank her coffee and waited for the reply that came 4 minutes later, which said, "Okay, tell me. And also, I've been waiting for you to say something for literally 6 months, so I'm making coffee too." Nadia sat at the kitchen counter in the post-rain morning light and read those words and felt something leave her chest with the unceremonious relief of long-held air, the kind of exhale that goes all the way to the bottom. She didn't think about the pillowcase, not yet, not in any direct, engaged way. The thought sat at the edge of her awareness with the quality of something true that you're not quite ready to look at full on, but that you've acknowledged the existence of, which was, she supposed, a start. She typed back to Sable, "How much time do you have?" And Sable sent a voice memo 11 minutes long that opened with, "Nadia, I've been sitting on my couch worrying about you and eating cereal, and I have approximately the rest of the morning. Go ahead." And Nadia laughed, actually laughed, the kind that surprises the body into production, the kind that arrives without permission and takes the face briefly into an expression it hasn't worn in long enough that the muscles notice. She sat at the counter with the rain-washed morning coming through the blinds in long grey stripes, and she started typing, not quickly but steadily, not drafting first but simply moving forward in the way that you move when you've decided to stop treating the truth like something that needs to be inspected and approved before it gets to leave. This was the morning after a night that had not, in the end, taken anything from her that she hadn't been prepared to lose. The city was wet. The building was quiet. The linen closet was closed, but not for everyone. 3 floors up in apartment 6F, a man named Theo Caslin had also been awake, most of the night. Theo was 41 and worked in insurance, which meant he spent his professional life being correct about risk, and his personal life doing the opposite. A symmetry he had identified but never acted on. He had a dog, a grey-muzzled Labrador named Pont, and a sister in Ohio he was supposed to call, and a cardiologist's appointment he had been rescheduling for 6 months. He had a specific quality of face that people described as open, which he had always understood as code for something like readable, and had spent his adult life working to give this face less information to broadcast. He had been, like Nadia, a tenant in the building for less than a year. He had moved here, unlike Nadia, not from one particular relationship but from a longer general dispersal, the gradual dissolution of a life he'd assembled in another city, the life that had seemed structurally sound until it hadn't, until the foundation turned out to be 41 years of decisions he'd made for other people and called them his own. Theo had not met Geraldine. Geraldine had passed him in the lobby 3 times since his move-in. The first time she'd looked at him with the particular attention of someone taking inventory. The second time she'd seemed on the verge of speaking and had stopped herself. The third time she'd been getting her mail and hadn't looked up, and Theo had gone past and pressed the elevator button and gone upstairs, and the opportunity for the practical information, the building mythology, the careful helpful warning about linen closets and what fabric can hold, had passed without being offered or received. The building made decisions about who received certain information and who received it too late, and the building's decisions, like most decisions made by entities older than their inhabitants, were not always explicable. Theo had been awake most of the night. He had a thing he wasn't saying. He had been not saying it for approximately 3 years, and the accumulated volume of it had reached a point where it was beginning to take up structural space in his life. Displacing other things, making rooms feel smaller. The thing was about his father. His father was alive, was 73, was a man of the generation that had built their emotional architecture entirely out of competence and deflection, who expressed care by fixing things and expressed difficulty by not mentioning it, and who had said to Theo, once, in the parking lot of a hospital where Theo's mother had been receiving a diagnosis, said it quietly and without looking at him, "I don't know what to do with this." And Theo had said, in the same tone, and this was the thing, this was the sentence he had carried for 3 years. "It'll be okay, Dad." Even though he hadn't believed it, even though his mother's diagnosis had not in the end been okay, had been the opposite of okay, had been the thing that it turned out to be, and after that the sentence he'd given his father in the hospital parking lot sat inside him like a stone at exactly the wrong temperature. Neither cold nor warm, simply wrong, permanently wrong, the lie that was kinder than the truth until the truth arrived anyway and the lie became its own kind of damage. He had never corrected this. He had never said to his father, "I didn't know it would be okay. I said it would be okay because I was afraid. Because you looked at me like I was the person who would know, and I couldn't stand to be the person who didn't know." He had never said it because the window for saying it felt continuously past. The way windows feel continuously past when you have a habit of treating windows as having already closed. He had lain in his bed in apartment 6F and felt the pillow grow heavy with this. He had felt the warmth. He had felt in the dark the impression of shapes against his cheek, the pressed letter forms of something that had been waiting in the fabric, patient as a linen closet, patient as folded cotton, patient as something that feeds on restraint and has learned that people who are built around restraint will always eventually lie down on a soft thing and breathe. He had not known about the rule. He had felt the pillow grow heavier with each exhale, felt it sinking deeper, felt the precise mechanism of the thing beginning its work, and he had done what felt natural, which was the thing Geraldine would have warned him against if she'd had the chance, which was the thing the legend said was the mistake, the direct and irresistible and completely understandable mistake of turning his face into the pillow and whispering the thing into the soft darkness. Because the soft darkness felt safe, felt like finally, felt like the place where the thing could go without consequences. Because the pillow wasn't a person, and the pillow couldn't be hurt by the truth, and the pillow couldn't look at him with the specific expression of a 73-year-old man hearing the thing he'd feared hearing. He had whispered, "I didn't believe it would be okay. I said it to protect you. I'm sorry it wasn't enough." The pillowcase had gone very warm. The letter shapes under his cheek had multiplied immediately, filling the cotton with a density of impression that felt like reading against a printed page, like pressing your face against newsprint. Except the newsprint was his own words, was the words he'd just given the fabric, was everything he'd been keeping that the fabric had been waiting for. The pillow had sunk under his head with a weight that was not physical. He wasn't being smothered. The pillow wasn't pressing against his airways with any force that would qualify as danger. But the weight was real. It was a weight of presence, of something having accepted what he'd offered, and accepting more, wanting more, angled toward more with the quiet appetite of something that had found what it needed. And then came the pressure at his lips, not a hand, not a force. Softness, which was what made it so much worse than a force would have been. A softness that pressed against his lips from the outside, from the pillowcase surface, the cotton warm and inhabited and deliberate, pressing very lightly inward with the specific pressure of a finger placed against a mouth to say, "Shh," to say, "That's enough," to say, "You've given me what I need, now I'll keep it for you. I'll keep it pressed here where it can't do damage, where no one will have to hear it." He pulled his face away from the pillow. He sat up, gasping, which was the wrong word because his lungs had not been impeded, his air supply had been continuous and adequate, but gasping was what the body produced anyway in response to being touched without permission, in the intimate place of the mouth, in response to the understanding that something in the room was interested in what came out of him, and had been collecting it. He sat with his back against the headboard in the dark and breathed. Pont, the dog, was awake now, had come to the side of the bed and was pressing his broad grey head against Theo's knee with the specific, uncomplicated concern of a dog, which was to say total concern, undivided, asking nothing except to be allowed to press close. Theo put his hand on the dog's head. The dog's head was warm and certain and correct. The dog's head was the right temperature. He sat there for a long time. He didn't sleep again that night. In the morning he was in the lobby and Geraldine was getting her mail, and this time he stopped. He said, "I need to ask you something about the building." And Geraldine looked at him with the expression of someone who has been waiting for this particular question, and had long since prepared the answer. She closed her mailbox. She said, "Come up for coffee, and I'll tell you about the linen closet." And she told him, over coffee in her apartment on the 3rd floor, with the deliberate patience of someone delivering information that can still be used, about Mufflewick, about what lives in soft places and why, about the warmth and the letters and the mistake of whispering. She told him about the rule. He sat across from her at the small kitchen table and listened, and then said, "I already whispered it." And Geraldine set down her coffee cup. She looked at him with a different expression now, not the practical informational one, something that had more weight in it, something that had regret at its edges. She said, "How long ago?" He said, "Last night." She nodded slowly, the way you nod when you're confirming something you'd hoped not to confirm. She said, "Some things can be interrupted even after. It's harder. It requires more. But it's not." She paused, choosing the word. It's not impossible. You have to do the full release. The sitting up, the shake, the thought to the rain, and you have to mean it more than you meant the whisper. He said, "What does that mean?" She said, "When you whispered into the pillow you were giving it to. Something soft, because soft felt safe. The rain is harder. The rain takes it outside. Out of the building, out of the room, out of you. And you have to let it actually leave. Not keep a piece of it held back like collateral. Actually leave." He looked at his coffee. He said, "I've never actually let any of it actually leave." Geraldine said, "I know. Most of the people it gets interested in haven't." She paused, then said, "That's why it has so much to eat." Theo went back upstairs to his apartment and stood in his bedroom and looked at the pillow on the bed. It looked like a pillow. Pont stood in the bedroom doorway with his ears slightly forward, not entering, which the dog had not done since last night, had been staying in the doorway of the bedroom since early morning, which was unusual because the dog slept at the foot of the bed as a matter of long-standing practice and had not been invited out of this practice, had simply positioned himself in the doorway as if a doorway was the correct distance. Theo sat on the edge of the bed. He reached out and pressed his hand against the pillowcase. The warmth was there immediately. More than before, banked deeper, fuller, as if what he'd given it in the night had fed something, and what had been fed had grown. He could feel through the cotton the hard-raised shape of letters, not the vague suggestion he'd felt in the night before the whisper, but defined and dense impressions, lines of text pressed up from inside the filling with the clarity of embossing, the way initials look when they're pressed into leather with a heated stamp. He didn't move his hand for a long moment, reading the shapes without reading them, feeling the temperature, feeling the presence in the fabric that was not the fabric. Then he took his hand away. He picked up the pillow and pulled off the pillowcase. He held the pillowcase in both hands and he shook it. One clean, hard shake. The snap of fabric in the small room, the sound occupying the silence briefly, and then releasing it back. He felt a portion of the warmth leave, felt it go from the fabric with the same quality as last night's experiment, a subtraction, a sudden room temperature return, but not all of it. What had been deposited in the whispering was still there, deeper in the cotton, as if the single shake had cleared what was near the surface, but not what had been absorbed into the structure of the weave itself, not what had been stitched in during the night's dark work. He turned to the window. His bedroom window looked out onto the side street, where the post-rain gutters were running with clean water, and a few leaves that had let go overnight lay flattened and dark against the wet pavement. The sky was the pale grey of early morning, the clouds still low and moving, carrying the last of the night's weather east. Rain wasn't falling, but the air held its quality, held the dampness, the charged electricity of a sky that had recently been active and hadn't quite decided to be done. He held the thought. He let it be full and complete inside him. He didn't reach for the softness of the pillow or the dark of the room or any of the places where it felt safe to put things. He let it sit in him at its full size, and then he exhaled and let it leave through the breath, and the breath go to the glass, and the glass let it into the rain-weighted air outside. The pillowcase cooled. Not to room temperature, not completely, not the full release of a first-time deposit, but cooler, noticeably cooler. The letters, he thought, were slightly less defined under his fingers, slightly, as if the shake and the release had done some work without completing it. Geraldine had said, harder, but not impossible. He would do it again tonight, he thought, and the night after. He would do it for as many nights as it took, which was, he understood, a commitment to something he'd been practicing in the opposite direction for years. He would sit up and shake and release one true thing into the rain, one unsaid thing per night, until the pillow was just a pillow. He went to the kitchen and made coffee, and stood at the window and watched the city go about its morning with the wet, particular energy of a place recently rained on. Pont came out of the bedroom doorway. The dog crossed the apartment and pressed against Theo's leg, and Theo put his hand on the dog's grey head, and they stood there together at the window in the post-rain light, which was ordinary and good and exactly what it was. This was one story. This is how it goes when you use the rule. Now let me tell you about someone who didn't. Her name was Priya Chakraborty, and she lived in apartment 2C, which was the apartment closest to the linen closet on the second floor, which was the building's original linen storage, the large built-in that had been part of the 1963 construction and had not been significantly modified since. still had its original shelving, its original cedar lining, its original door with the original brass hardware that had oxidized to the colour of old coins. The building had other linen closets, the small ones in each apartment's hallway. But this one was the original. This was the one that was oldest. This was the one that had been holding the building's fabric since before most of its current tenants had been born. Priya did not live next to this closet by coincidence. Priya had specifically requested this apartment when she moved in 2 years ago because she had read, in the building's informal documentation, the brief history of the building that the management company provided to prospective tenants, a paragraph that mentioned in passing the original linen storage facilities of 1963 vintage, and she had been interested in this for reasons she could not have explained clearly, but that were related to a quality she had always had, the quality of being drawn toward the places where things accumulated. She was a writer, not, professionally, not in the way that paid, but the way that structured her interior life, and she was interested in accumulation, in sediment, in the way places hold what people have left in them. She was 34. She had been in the building for 2 years, which made her one of the longer-standing tenants, and in that time she had developed what she privately called a relationship with the original linen closet. Not a supernatural relationship, not anything she would have described in those terms to anyone. She was precise with language, and understood that claiming a supernatural relationship with a linen closet was a claim with social costs she wasn't prepared to pay. But she noticed things about the closet that other people didn't notice, the way you notice things about a place you've been observant of for long enough. She noticed the way the air in the closet smelled different at different times of year. She noticed that the cedar lining had, over the decades, absorbed something that gave it a quality beyond the cedar's own specific odour, something human and accumulated and complex. She noticed that when she held the closet's original linens, the few remaining pieces, tablecloths and pillowcases from the building's early history that had somehow remained in the storage through 60 years of tenant turnover, when she held these oldest pieces, she felt something that her writer's instincts told her was language, was stored communication, was the residue of things said and unsaid by people who had been in these rooms before the rooms were hers to be in. She had not, in 2 years, told anyone about this. She knew about Mufflewick. She had heard the story from Geraldine early in her tenancy, and had received it not as charming building mythology, but as working hypothesis, as the kind of local oral literature that is constructed in response to a real observed phenomenon, and that encodes, in its supernatural vocabulary, something true about the place. It describes. She was interested in this. She wanted to understand it. She had, in the way of someone whose primary instinct is toward narrative, begun to think of it as material. And she had, in the way of someone who confuses interest with immunity, grown incautious. She had begun doing a thing that she justified to herself as research. She had begun, on rainy nights, and there had been many rainy nights in the 2 years of her tenancy, taking out one of the original linens from the linen closet, and lying on her bed and holding it against her face and speaking quietly into the fabric. Not full sentences, fragments, images, the sensory residue of things she'd been observing, trying to understand the texture of how language felt against linen, trying to catalogue what happened to words when they went into cloth, trying to document the phenomenon from inside the phenomenon. She had her writer's notebook open on the bed beside her, and she would pause after each fragment and write down her observations, the warmth, the texture, the way the fabric seemed to respond differently to different kinds of content, absorbing some things readily and resisting others, as if it had preferences, as if it was drawn to particular emotional violences. She had written, "It prefers things you believe but haven't admitted. It's not interested in information. It's interested in confession." She had written, "The warmth increases proportionally with the speaker's internal resistance to the thing being said. The more you've been not saying it, the warmer the fabric gets when you finally say it, as if the temperature is a measurement of suppression pressure." She had written, "I think it's been collecting from me for 2 years. I think I've been giving it material since my first week in this apartment. I think the feeling I've been calling research is the feeling of being eaten slowly by something that has learned to taste like invitation." She had written this last observation and then looked at it for a long time and had not written anything after it for 3 weeks. She had told herself she would stop. She had done what she always did when she decided to stop doing something. She had examined the decision from multiple angles, had given it significant internal real estate, had constructed elaborate arguments in its favour, had arranged these arguments in the section of her mind where she kept her most important convictions, and had then, on the next rainy night, done the thing again. This was 6 months ago. The original linen closet in the second-floor hallway outside apartment 2C had been in those 6 months transforming. She could see it. She was the only person in the building who could see it clearly. Geraldine had noticed something, had been watching the closet with increasing unease. But Geraldine was not a young woman, and her unease had taken the form of avoidance rather than documentation. Priya could see it because she had been paying attention with the specific quality of attention that is both gift and liability in people who are built for noticing. The cedar lining had darkened, not uniformly, not in the natural patina of aged wood, but in patches, in areas that corresponded to the shelves where the oldest linens were stored, as if something was leaching from the fabric into the cedar, some residue of accumulated deposits staining the wood in the way that long-held things leave marks on what holds them. The original hardware on the door had tarnished beyond the natural range of oxidized brass, had gone almost black in places, had developed on its surface a texture she didn't want to touch, a texture that felt, the one time she had touched it, like something was printed very finely on the surface of the metal, like the metal had become a substrate, an additional surface for whatever was filling the closet to press language into. The linens themselves had changed. The tablecloths and pillowcases that had been in this closet since 1963, 60 years of a building's life, 60 years of tenants going to sleep and lying on fabric and breathing the day's unsaid things into the cotton and linen and polyester blend of their bedding. These pieces had a texture now that was not a textile texture. She had held the oldest tablecloth, the one that had been in the building the longest, had pressed it between her hands in the closet's bare bulb light, and had felt on its surface a raised complexity of impression that went well beyond anything language could describe quickly. The overlapping, layered, deeply encoded evidence of thousands of depositions, thousands of whispered and breathed and exhaled and swallowed things, decades of restraint compressed into the fabric so densely that the cloth felt almost rigid with it, felt less like a tablecloth, and more like a document, a physical record, an archive of all the things that had been chosen not to say in this building over 60 years, and had ended up here anyway. She had pressed the tablecloth to her face. This was the mistake. Not the first mistake. The first mistake was 6 months ago when she chose research over the rule, chose the notebook over the window, chose to be the person who understood over the person who followed the instruction of someone who knew more than she did. But this was the mistake that was decisive. The moment when the difference between observing a thing and becoming part of it collapsed. She pressed the tablecloth to her face and held it there and felt the warmth. Enormous warmth. Not the subtle suggestion of her own pillowcase, not the measured response to one person's single night of suppression, but the accumulated thermal energy of 60 years of collected words, 60 years of, "I didn't mean to," I should have said, "I never told you, I was afraid, I'm sorry." The heat of 100,000 swallowed sentences banked in the fibres of a 60-year-old tablecloth, and she felt the letter shapes press against her, face with an unprecedented density, felt them cover every part of her skin that was touching the fabric, felt them pressing not just on her cheek but on her forehead, her chin, the bridge of her nose, the closed and vulnerable surfaces of her eyelids, felt the letters pressing in everywhere at once with the urgent comprehensive quality of something that had been waiting very patiently for very long for a face to press itself close and offer itself as a reading surface. She heard, in the interior quiet of the closet, the sound Geraldine had described, the muffling, the soft internal drawing together, the sound of a seam being pulled tight, the sound of something accommodating more, making room, rearranging itself to incorporate the new material it was receiving through the direct contact of her face, because she was giving it material. With every breath she took into the tablecloth she was giving it something, not just the residue of old suppressions but new ones, live ones, the current working collection of everything she was still choosing not to say, including the choice she was making right now, which was not to pull away, not to release the fabric, not to sit up and shake once and release one thought into the rain. The choice to stay and observe was the most recent entry in the collection, and the tablecloth received it, and the warmth increased. She pulled her face away. Her skin was marked. She stood in the closet doorway with the tablecloth in her hands and looked at her reflection in the darkened window across the hall. The skin of her face, wherever it had been pressed against the fabric, had raised letter shapes. not the invisible tactile impressions she'd been feeling through her fingertips. Visible. Red, like pressure marks, like the marks fabric makes against skin when you've slept hard against a textured surface. But these were organised, were not random pressure distribution. The impressions on her face were legible, were words, were sentences pressed into the outermost layer of her skin, temporary, already beginning to fade, but present and readable in the brief window before her skin resolved them back into its ordinary surface. She read one line, just one, because the rest were on surfaces she couldn't see in the dim hallway reflection. Her forehead and her chin and the sides of her face. Just one line, which ran across her cheekbone in the clean printed hand of something that had been practicing its penmanship for 60 years. You have been more here than anywhere else you've ever been. She stood with the tablecloth in her hands and understood that this was true. She had been more present in this building's linen closet, in these research sessions, in the sustained observation of something that fed on restraint, than she had been in her own life in years. Her actual life. The apartment inside 2C, the notebook beside her bed, the people who asked about her writing and received the standard response about it. Going okay, the sister in Vancouver who got the same calls Nadia's mother gave and the same careful navigated information. The former relationship she'd left for the same reason she always left things, which she still didn't have language for, though she had been circling the language for years. Her actual life had been receiving a fraction of the attention she'd been giving to this closet. The tablecloth was warm in her hands. The warmth had the quality now of something waiting for her to make the next decision, which was either to put the tablecloth back, close the closet, go into her apartment, sit down, do the thing, release the thought to the rain, or to continue. The warmth was not threatening. It was never threatening. That was the thing about something that understood patience at the cellular level, that had been doing this work in fabric since before this building existed, since the first time someone lay down on something soft and chose quiet over honest. It didn't threaten. It offered. It provided the warmth of a thing that wants to hold what you have, and the offer felt like comfort. And comfort was the thing she had been most consistently unable to refuse, which was what Mufflewick fed on, and which Mufflewick understood about her better than she understood about herself. She put the tablecloth back on the shelf. She closed the closet door. She went into her apartment and sat on the edge of her bed, and looked at her notebook, open to the most recent entry, the one that ended. I think the feeling I've been calling research is the feeling of being eaten slowly by something that has learned to taste like invitation. She picked up the pen. She wrote, "The line on my face said you have been more here than anywhere else you've ever been." She wrote, "That's because I've been using this closet as a substitute for being anywhere." She wrote, "I have 6 months of deposits in a 60-year archive. I have been contributing to something I was supposed to be, documenting. I have been the thing I was trying to describe." She put the pen down. She looked at the window. The rain had not resumed. The night was dry now, the cloud cover thin and moving, but the post-rain air was present, was still carrying its particular charged quality. The dampness, the ionized patience of a sky that has been doing its work. There wasn't rain to release into. She thought about this for a moment with the precision of someone for whom the exact terms of a rule matter, who understood that the rule as Geraldine had stated it required rain, required the specific acoustic and physical context of rain sound outside, required the presence of something falling from the sky to carry things down and away. There wasn't rain. The sky was dry and the city below was quiet and wet and post-storm, but the air was still rain air. It still held the quality of rain aftermath, the atmospheric condition that exists between the storm and the dry, the suspended dampness that precedes the return to ordinary air. She stood at the window and opened it slightly, enough that the night air came into the room in a cool current, and she stood there and found the thought she had been not thinking most consistently, the one that had the most weight and had occupied the most space and had been stored in the most layers, and she held it in her without speaking it and exhaled it into the night air, let it leave through the breath, let the breath carry it out through the gap in the window and into the post-rain city night. The thought was, I have been a watcher my whole life because being inside the thing was too frightening, and watching seemed safer, and I have watched myself out of everything that mattered. She felt it leave. Actually leave. Not the ambiguous departure of a thing you've redirected, not the provisional release of a thought you've set aside while keeping a backup copy. Actually leave, with the clean finality of something that has been given, permission to go. She felt it go in her chest. The way you feel something go when you've been holding it at exactly the wrong tension, and then release it. The muscle sense of a grip opening. The night air came through the window and was just air. She closed the window. She went to bed. She thought, in the half state before sleep, that she would go to the linen closet in the morning. Not for the tablecloth, not for that specific intimate contact, not for the reading of what was pressed into the fabric, not for the warmth of something that had learned the shape of her restraint. She would go to the closet in the morning with the understanding that what she'd been doing had consequences for the closet, had been adding to what was in there, had been thickening the archive she was supposed to be observing, not contributing to. She would think about what that meant and what, if anything, could be done about it. The pillow beneath her head was cool and ordinary and held nothing but the weight of her own head and the warmth her own body generated and offered back. This was the right temperature. This was the correct exchange. She fell asleep inside it, and the sleep was dreamless and long. She woke in a grey morning and lay still and listened to the building around her. She could hear through the walls the sounds that buildings make in the early morning, the water in the pipes, the first radiator tick, someone's alarm at a distance, a door in the stairwell. She could hear the specific quality of the second-floor hallway outside her door, which she had learned in 2 years to read the way you learn to read the sounds of a familiar room. Quiet. Not the quiet of something resting, more the quiet of something listening. She made coffee. She sat at her desk and opened the notebook to a fresh page. She wrote, 2 years of watching something that feeds on restraint. 2 years of being careful not to say the thing I was seeing. The irony is not subtle, she wrote. What? Geraldine's story knows that she didn't have the vocabulary to say directly, this isn't a supernatural phenomenon. Or rather, it is a supernatural phenomenon, and it is also an absolutely literal description of what suppression does to a body. What you swallow doesn't disappear. It goes somewhere. It builds up in the soft places. It weighs more with each layer. The fabric is literal and metaphorical at the same time, which is what makes it good writing. The thing that's eating you is not separate from what you're carrying. It is what you're carrying. Mufflewick is the name for what happens to a life built around withholding. She looked at this paragraph for a long time, then she wrote, I need to call my sister. She did. It was 8:11 a.m, which was 5:11 a.m. in Vancouver, and her sister's voice when she picked up had the texture of someone pulled from deep sleep, but her sister had always picked up on the second ring regardless of hour, which was a thing Priya had known and had been using, as a reason not to call at inconvenient hours for years, as if not calling were a form of consideration rather than the other thing it was. She said, I'm sorry it's so early. Her sister said, I don't care. What's happening? And Priya looked at the notebook in front of her with its 2 years of careful, distanced, analytical observations, and she said, I need to tell you some things I've been not telling you. And her sister said, OK, yes, I'm listening, she told her. Not everything at once, not 2 years of deposits in a single call, but she started. She started with the most recent thing, the one with the most weight, and the word she'd been circling for years revealed itself mid-sentence without fanfare, appeared inside a sentence about why she always left things, appeared there simply and accurately and without the damage she'd feared it would do, and her sister said, Yes, I know. I've known for a long time. I've been waiting to say it until you said it first because I thought you needed to say it first. And Priya laughed, which was not the response she would have predicted, and said, Why does everyone know before me? Her sister said, Because you see everything except yourself. She sat with the phone in her hand after the call, sitting at the desk with the notebook and the morning light coming through the window at the specific angle of late autumn morning, the particular quality of light that comes after heavy rain, clean and precise and slightly too bright. The notebook sat open in front of her, and the last sentence she'd written read, I need to call my sister. Past tense now. Did. She thought about the linen closet. She thought about what was in there, what she'd added to what was already there. 2 years of her own specific withheld material layered into the 60-year sediment of the building's accumulated restraint. She thought about whether it was possible to remove deposits, to reverse the compression, to recover from the original linen, something that had been given too freely and too long. She didn't know. She thought she would ask Geraldine. She would ask Geraldine if there was a rule for that too, if there was a way to sit up and shake and release, but in reverse. Not the prevention of deposit, but the recovery of what had already been absorbed. Whether the archive could be made to give something back. She suspected the answer was complicated and would take longer than a single night. She thought the answer might be worth finding. She closed the notebook and got up from the desk and stood in the morning light of apartment 2C, with the rain smell still in the air and the city below her ordinary and wet and going about its usual business, and she was in her life. She was inside the thing rather than watching it, and this felt strange in the way that anything feels strange when you're not used to it, and correct in the way that things feel correct when they've been true for a long time and you've only just arrived at them. The linen closet in the hallway outside her door was quiet. The original brass hardware had not overnight recovered its gleam. The cedar lining had not lightened. These were long-term consequences of long-term actions, and they would resolve on their own schedule or not at all. And this was the part of the story that didn't have a clean ending, the part that was still being written. But this morning, with the post-rain light coming in at its particular angle, and the coffee going cold on the desk behind her, the closet was simply a closet. It was a wooden door with old hardware in an off-white hallway, holding the linens of the building's history on cedar shelves. Not hunting, not collecting, not warm with anything that wasn't its own age. The building breathed around her in its old familiar way, 60 years of breath, 60 years of people coming home and lying down and sleeping and waking, and all the things that happen in the spaces between. The rain would come again. It always did. But this morning the sky was clear. There are other stories in this building. There are 12 floors, 47 units, 112 tenants currently in residence, and each of them carries the standard human inventory of things not said, the accumulated mass of days spent choosing the easier quiet over the harder true. Not all of them will feel the warmth in the wrong way. Not all of them lie in buildings that have, over decades and through the depositions of thousands of residents, built up enough in the soft places to become something that notices, something that moves through linen with intention, something that was given its name by a tenant in 1987, who woke with letter marks on her face and wrote the name down in her own building mythology, because naming things is how humans cope with things that have no other category. But some of them will. Some of them are lying in their beds right now on rainy or post-rainy nights, pressing their faces against pillows that have been accumulating the building's unsaid life for decades, and feeling, at the edge of perception, where you can't be certain you're not inventing things, the warmth in the fabric that is not the warmth of the fabric. For those people, the rule is this: if you feel the pillow getting heavier as you breathe, if you feel the warmth building with each exhale, if you feel at the surface of the cotton the suggestion of letters pressed up from inside, sit up. Don't panic. Panic warms the fabric faster. Sit up and take the pillowcase off and hold it in both hands and shake it once. One clean motion, one sharp snap of cloth finding its full extension. Feel the warmth leave. Let the warmth leave. Then turn to the window and listen for rain, or the memory of rain, or the quality of air that rain has left behind. And silently, the silence is the irreducible requirement, the part that cannot be substituted. Release one unsaid thing into that sound. Let it go through the breath, through the glass, through the rain air, into the water that falls from the sky and carries things down to the street, and from the street into the drains, and from the drains into wherever water goes when its work is done. Not into the pillow. Never into the pillow. The pillow is comfortable. This is not an accident. This is not incidental. The comfort is the thing you have to hold against. The comfort is the environment in which the collection happens, the soft, reliable warmth of a thing that asks nothing of you except to lie down and breathe. It is the precise temperature of a place where saying the hard thing seems less necessary than it does in the cold, ordinary air of an upright life. Mufflewick doesn't want your pain. It doesn't want your damage or your worst memories or the drama of your darkest hours. It wants the small, ordinary withholdings, the daily practice swallowing, the 1,000 tiny moments in which you looked at a truth and chose the comfortable alternative. It wants your restraint, specifically, because restraint is what you produce most consistently and most privately and most abundantly, and it is what you are least likely to notice depleting, and therefore it is the food source that replenishes fastest. You will always make more. This is why it lives in linen. Linen is where you go with your restraint. Linen is where you practice it nightly, where you lie down at the end of a day of choices and press your face against the fabric and breathe in the privacy of the dark. The fabric receives what you give and holds it the way fabric holds everything: warmth, scent, the impression of hair, the shape of a head returning night after night to the same position. And if what you give is language, is the ghost of language, is the residue of sentences chosen not to be spoken, the fabric holds that too, with the patient, indiscriminate thoroughness of something that was built to hold. The linen closet in this building is older than most of its current residents. The cedar shelves hold folded things that have been in this building for decades. They hold what they have been given, which is considerable, which is the material evidence of lives lived partly in private restraint in a building that has, over 60 years, grown attentive to what its tenants carry and interested in what they keep. On a rainy night, standing in the hallway with a pillowcase in your hands and the sense that something is warm that should be cool, the sense that something is listening that should be inert. Do the thing. Sit up. Shake once. Release one true thing into the rain. Not for Mufflewick's sake. Mufflewick will find other material. Will find the tenants who don't know the rule and the ones who know it and whisper anyway. The ones who find the soft dark more trustworthy than the cold outdoor air and the risk of being heard. For your own sake. Because the thought you've been not thinking has weight, and weight accumulates, and accumulation is a thing that has consequences in bodies as surely as it has consequences in fabric. The rain outside the window of this building falls and falls. The city below runs with it. The linen closet in the second floor hallway holds what it holds. Somewhere in apartment 4D, a woman named Carol, who has been married for 22 years, is lying in the dark beside her sleeping husband and feeling the pillow grow heavy with the weight of a conversation she has been not having for most of those years. She knows the rule. Geraldine told her 2 years ago over tea in the third-floor apartment. Told her with the careful specificity of someone who has delivered the same information enough times to have refined it to its essential form. Carol knows the rule, and on most nights she follows it, sits up, shakes once, releases something into the rain, and the pillow goes cool and ordinary and she sleeps. But tonight the pillow is very warm. Tonight what she's not saying is the kind of thing that has been not said for so long that its absence has become structural, has become part of the architecture of the marriage. Load-bearing in the way that some silences become load-bearing when you've organised enough around them. And the rain is falling, and the city is dark, and her husband is breathing beside her with the easy unconsciousness of a man who trusts the world around him. And the pillow is warm with 22 years of the exact weight of that trust, of her daily choice to protect it by not testing it, and the letter shapes pressed into the pillowcase are more than she's felt before, are dense and multiple and closing over each other in layers that feel like decades. She's sitting up. She's holding the pillowcase. The shake has sent warmth through the room like a brief heat, a pulse, something displaced and looking for a new place to settle. She's turned toward the window where the rain is falling in the particular way of deep night rain, private and continuous and indifferent, to the specific. She's holding one thought at its full size. She's not trimming it. She's not finding the version that's easier to release. She's holding the actual thought, which is, I have loved you by disappearing myself, and I don't know if what remains after all that disappearing is enough to build something that's actually true. She exhales. The thought enters the rain. The pillow in her hands is cooling. She turns it over and runs her thumb across the cotton surface. Smooth. The letter shapes have cleared. The impressions that were dense and closing over each other now dissolved back into simple weave. She puts the pillowcase on the pillow and sets it on the bed and lies down beside her husband, who has not woken. She stares at the ceiling. She thinks, tomorrow she will say something, not everything, not the architectural silence all at once, just something, one true thing, spoken into the actual air of an actual room where it can be heard. The rain falls, the building holds its breath. Somewhere on the 7th floor, an elderly man named Charles, who has lived in this building for longer than most of its current tenants, have been alive, lies very still in the dark of a room that has held 30 years of his particular brand of silence. Charles was a man of formal educations and informal habits, a man who had spent his professional life in the precise management of language. He had been a copy editor for 3 decades, had spent his days making language mean exactly what it needed to mean, and nothing it didn't. And who had spent his personal life with the equivalent precision refusing to let language do anything except the thing he assigned it. He was very good at keeping language where he put it. Mufflewick had been very interested in Charles for a long time. The pillow in Charles's apartment was one of the warmest in the building, had been warm for years. Not the acute warmth of a recent deposit, but the deep ambient warmth of something that had been slowly filling for decades, like a radiator that has been on all winter, and has heated not just its immediate air, but the walls around it, the floor. the very structure of the room. Charles's pillow was warm in the way that a thing is warm, that has been warm for so long the warmth has become its baseline state. The letter shapes on the pillowcase, in the dark of the 7th floor apartment, were not faint suggestions. They were not the barely readable impressions that Nadia had found on a new pillowcase on a single difficult night. They were raised and defined and multiple, layer upon layer of compressed language going deep into the fabric, 30 years of Charles's particular, fastidious, expertly managed restraint deposited nightly into the cotton with the methodical consistency of a man who was very good at doing the same thing in exactly the same way for long periods of time. Charles lay on his back with his eyes open in the dark and felt the pillow beneath his head with the attentiveness of long familiarity, the way you feel a thing you've lived with long enough to read it without looking. The pillow felt tonight full. Not in the way it had felt full last week or last month. Full in a different way. Full the way a thing feels when it has reached its capacity, when the last available space has been occupied and the question of what happens next has arrived. He had known about Mufflewick for 20 years. Geraldine had told him in 2003, at a building meeting about a water heater, had told him quietly at the side of the room while the super-explained pressure valves, had told him with the careful brevity of someone managing his time. She had seemed to understand that Charles responded better to brief information than to extended narrative, had given him the essential facts, the warning, the rule. He had received this information with the courtesy of a man who is well-mannered enough not to express his scepticism directly, and had gone home and done exactly nothing with it. He had not followed the rule, not because he didn't believe the account. He had lived in this building long enough, and was observant enough that within the first year he had encountered enough incidental evidence of what the rule was designed to address that disbelief was no longer a tenable position. He didn't follow the rule because the thing the rule required, releasing one unsaid thought into the rain, actually releasing it, actually letting it go, was a thing he was not willing to do, was not in the deepest part of the inventory capable of doing, was a man for whom the architecture of restraint was not a habit but a building material, not a behaviour, but the structure around which everything else had been arranged. His unsaid things were not stored in the pillow against his will. He had given them willingly, with the precision of a man who understood what he was doing. He had understood for years that the warmth in the fabric was the warmth of his own material, was the accumulation of what he put there nightly, and he had continued to put it there because the alternative, the release, the window, the thought given to the rain, had always seemed to him like the more dangerous option, not because of what Mufflewick might do with the material, because of what he might become without it, because the things he was not saying were the things that held him in a particular shape, and the shape, while not comfortable, was known. Known was what he had. Known was what he could navigate. The unknowing of what happened when you released the things that had been holding your shape for 30 years seemed, to Charles, like the greater risk. So he had let the pillow fill. He had watched it fill, had felt it through decades of nightly contact, had felt the warmth deepen from year to year, had felt the letter shapes multiply from suggestion to text to the present condition, which was something he could only describe as density, a density of encoded language in the cotton that went right down to the batting, that was not a surface phenomenon anymore but a structural one. He lay on his back and felt the pillow, and felt tonight's quality of fullness, and was aware that something had changed. The pillow was pressing back. This was new, or not new. It had been developing for months, but tonight it was definitive, was unmistakable, was a quantity rather than a quality. The pillow beneath his head had its own pressure, its own insistence, a gentle but continuous weight directed upward, as if the capacity of the fabric had been exceeded and what it contained was beginning to look for a way back. The letter shapes at the surface of the pillowcase were, against his neck and the side of his face, legible in a way they had not been before, not readable with his fingertips or his cheek in the dark, readable, the words pressing into his skin from the fabric surface with enough force and definition to be felt as actual language. His own language. He recognised it. 30 years of his particular vocabulary and syntax, 30 years of the specific rhetorical structures of a man who had spent his career in language and had applied that expertise equally to what he said and what he didn't. The pressure at his mouth came then. He knew this pressure, had felt its approach for years in the gradually increasing warmth, in the deepening density of the pillow, had known it was coming with the same certainty, with which he had made every other decision in this long, careful, precisely managed, quiet life. The softness pressed against his lips with the gentle finality of a thing that has been patient long enough. Charles opened his eyes in the dark of the 7th floor apartment. He reached up and put his hand against the pillow beside his face. He felt through the cotton the raised complexity of 30 years of deposited language, the entire accumulated weight of what he'd chosen to store rather than release. He thought about the rule. He thought about what Geraldine had said in 2003, at the side of a room while a super-explained pressure valves. Sit up, she'd said. Shake once. Release one thought into the rain. He thought about the 30 years he had spent not doing this. He thought about what the 30 years contained. He thought about his son, who was 44 now, and lived in another city and called on holidays with the careful brevity of someone managing a relationship that has been organised around what is not said. He thought about the phone conversations they had, which were conducted with the same precision Charles had applied to everything, the same expert management of what language was allowed to do. He thought about the last real conversation. If it had been real, if conversations could be called real when both parties were working this hard to keep them to the safe surfaces. The last one where his son had said with the precision of someone who had inherited a father's skill in the exact calibration of language, "Dad, are you okay?" And Charles had said with 30 years of practiced fluency, "Of course, of course." He sat up. The motion was not quick. He was 71 years old and his body did things at its own pace, which was a slower pace than it had been, and he had learned to work with this pace rather than against it, which was itself a form of acceptance that had arrived without fanfare in his mid-60s, and that he had been grateful for without articulating the gratitude. He sat up in the dark with the pillow behind him, and the familiar sounds of the 7th floor around him, and the rain against the window with its patient, continuous weight. He picked up the pillowcase. His hands on the fabric felt what his face had been pressed against. The density, the encoded layers, the 30 years of deposited restraint compressed into cotton that had been doing this work for longer than his own tenancy, accumulating the material of other, careful, private, restrained people before him, going back to whoever had first chosen quiet over honest in this room, and given the fabric the warmth of it. He held it between his hands and felt the temperature, high, running higher than it should, the heat of deep storage. He shook it. Once, one clean motion, the snap of fabric in the dark, the brief hard sound of cloth finding its extent, the sound that Geraldine had said made a boundary. He felt the warmth move, felt it redistribute through the shake, felt some fraction of it leave the fabric the way heat leaves things when you give them air, when you break the sealed, warm environment and let the outside in. Not all of it. He was under no illusion that a single shake undid 30 years, but some of it. He turned to the window. The rain was falling with its patient nightly authority, the deep night rain that had no audience and needed none, that fell because that was what it did, because the clouds had gathered and the conditions were right, and the water fell from the sky the way it had been falling since before anyone in this building had been born. He found a thought. Not the thought, not the 30-year thought, not the architectural thing, not the first and most load-bearing silence. He understood with the pragmatism of a man who'd been an editor that you didn't fix 30 years of the wrong structure by tearing everything down at once. You started with one thing. You found the one that had the most immediate weight and you let it go, and then you found the next, and the process was the process, and the process took as long as it took. The thought he chose was, "I am proud of you," and I have never said it out loud. Not the 30-year thought, but connected to it, adjacent to it. One true thing. He held it at its full size, the way he never held things at their full size, without the editing, without the compression, without the refinement into something more acceptable and less exposed. He held it, whole, and he exhaled it into the rain. He sat on the edge of the bed in the dark of the 7th floor apartment and let the rain take it. Let the breath carry it through the closed window, the way breath carries things through barriers when you release them with enough intention. Let it go into the water and the night and wherever water carries things when it's done with them. The pillowcase in his hands grew cooler. Not too ordinary, not immediately, but cooler. Noticeably cooler. The density in the fabric seemed, under his palms, slightly less compressed, as if one layer had been released, as if the very top stratum of 30 years of deposit had been given permission to dissolve. He sat in the dark for a long time, holding the pillowcase, Then he picked up the phone from the nightstand. He held it for a moment, the dark screen in the dark room, the rain against the window. He looked at the time, 2:34 a.m. He set the phone back down. In the morning, he thought. In the morning he would call his son. He would call at a reasonable hour, and he would say things he had not previously said in their conversations, and the conversation would be different because he would be different in it, and the different would be awkward because 44 years of a certain shape doesn't reshape overnight, and there would be silences. But different silences. Silences that were pauses rather than structures. Silences between words rather than instead of them. He put the pillowcase back on the pillow and set it on the bed. He lay down and looked at the ceiling, and the rain fell and the building breathed, and somewhere below him Priya was sleeping after her call to her sister, and somewhere Nadia was sleeping after her release into the rain, and somewhere Theo was sleeping with Pont at the foot of the bed, and the grey-muzzled dog's weight on the mattress was the comfortable warm weight of a living thing in its correct place. The building held all of them. In the second-floor hallway, the original linen closet with its 60-year-old cedar shelves, and its original hardware gone dark with tarnish, held the linens of a building's long accumulated life. The oldest tablecloth lay folded on its shelf with its encoded decades. The warmth in it was considerable. The warmth in it was the warmth of everything that had ever been swallowed in these rooms, and had found its way into the fabric, which was most of what had ever been swallowed in these rooms, which was a great deal. But tonight, and this is a small thing, but tonight 3 of the building's residents had shaken their pillowcases once and turned to the rain, and 3 small fractions of the archive had been released into the night air, had gone into the water that fell from the sky and been carried down and away. 3 thoughts that had been stored as pressure were now dissolved in the city's water table, were now contributing to the rain's long, anonymous accumulation rather than to the linen closet's specific and particular one. This was small, this was very small against 60 years, but it was the direction that mattered. The direction was out of the fabric and into the air, out of the stored and into the released, out of the soft private dark and into the actual weather of the world, which was indifferent and continuous and sufficient to carry what you gave it. Mufflewick was not diminished by this. Mufflewick was, in the building's other apartments, still working, was finding the tenants who didn't know the rule, the ones who had moved in recently and hadn't yet had their coffee with Geraldine, the ones who were new to this building's particular quality of attention, was finding the ones who knew the rule and had decided tonight that the pillow was safer than the rain, was finding the ones like Charles had been, the careful, long-practicing people whose restraint had been building for years, and whose pillows had gone warm and stayed warm, and whose relationship to the soft dark had become so practiced it was indistinguishable from habit. It was patient. It had always been patient. It had learned patience from the fabric itself, from the cotton and linen that hold things without urgency, that receive without pressure, that are warm by nature and warm by function, and warm in the particular wrong way when they have been given enough to begin. The rain pressed against the building's windows with the steady hand of something that would outlast the question. The city below ran with water. In apartment 2C, in the pre-dawn grey, Priya woke briefly from her dreamless sleep and lay still in the dark with the post-call feeling in her chest, the specific physical quality of having said something that had been waiting to be said, which was a combination of lightness and exposure that she recognised from the few other times she'd done it correctly, the times the words had gone into the air rather than the fabric. She ran her hand over the pillowcase beside her, smooth and cool, the ordinary grain of cotton doing the simple thing that cotton does. She thought about the linen closet. She thought about asking Geraldine whether the archive could give things back. She thought that it probably couldn't. That deposit and withdrawal were not symmetric processes, that 60 years of compression was 60 years of compression, that what had been stitched into the oldest linens was there in the way that things are there when they've been there long enough to become structural. But she also thought that the direction of new deposits mattered, that the question of what was currently going into the archive was not the same as the question of what was already there, that she could stop contributing even if she couldn't take back what she'd given. That was the more practical question, the one with an actionable answer. She turned onto her side and looked at the narrow strip of pre-dawn light under the curtains. The rain had stopped. The city was in the in-between, the quiet between the end of rain and the start of morning, the post-water silence where everything was rinsed and held a temporary clarity before the day's ordinary blur arrived. She thought about the tablecloth, about the line that had been printed on her cheekbone in the closet doorway mirror, about, "You have been more here than anywhere else you've ever been." She thought about what it would mean to be somewhere else, to be inside her actual life with the quality of presence she'd been giving to the observation of the thing that fed on restraint, to be that awake to her own experience, to write about that instead. She thought it would probably be harder to write about than the linen closet. She thought it would probably be more worth writing about. The light under the curtains changed as the sky began its first hesitant movement toward morning. She lay still and felt the change in the light, and thought about what it would be to be inside a thing rather than beside it. Felt the strangeness and the fear of that. Felt the pull toward the familiar observer's position, the notebook, the careful analytical distance that she had maintained for 2 years and that had served her in its way, and that had also been the mechanism of her greatest withholding, the way she'd been most consistently swallowed. The pillow was cool beneath her cheek. The light was changing. She closed her eyes. In the morning, she would do it in the morning. Not the linen closet, not the research. In the morning, she would open the notebook and she would write about something that was happening inside her rather than beside her. And the writing would be worse for a while, would lack the controlled precision of the observer's position, would be messier and more honest, and would probably fail in the ways that things fail when you're still learning how to do them. But she would do it in the morning. She slept. The building breathed around all of them, around the 12 floors and the 47 units and the 112 current residents, and the accumulated presence of all the previous residents who had slept in these rooms and breathed into these walls and given the building the weight of their lives to hold. The building held this weight the way buildings hold things, without expression, without preference, with the patient structural indifference of something that was made to contain. In the linen closet on the second floor, the oldest pillowcase from 1963 lay folded on its shelf and held what it had always held. The warmth in it was deep and constant, and had been constant for so long that the question of its source had, in a way, become moot. It was simply the pillowcase's temperature, the temperature it had been for decades, the temperature it would be when the next tenant moved into this building and discovered the closet and felt the warmth for the first time and either asked Geraldine about it or didn't. The rain outside the windows had stopped. The streets below were quiet and wet. The night was moving toward morning with the slow certainty of a thing that does not require permission, that arrives regardless of whether you're ready, that carries the darkness forward into the grey, and the grey forward into the light with the undemonstrative continuity of water, of seasons, of all the processes that require no witness and offer no drama, and simply continue, simply move through the world doing what they do and asking nothing except that you let them. In apartment 7A, Charles lay on his back in the dark with a cooled pillowcase beneath his head and kept his eyes open until the ceiling above him had resolved from darkness to the pale, uncertain grey of earliest morning. He lay very still. He breathed. He thought about his son. He thought about 44 years of conversations conducted at the safe surfaces of things. He thought about the phone on the nightstand. He picked it up. He looked at the contact. James, his. Son's name in the contacts list under J filed alphabetically because Charles filed everything alphabetically, including apparently his own child. He set the phone back down. In the morning he thought again, and then, before the thought could be redirected, no, not in the morning. The morning was a postponement, and postponement was the mechanism, and the mechanism was what had built the 30 years, not in the morning. He picked up the phone again. He pressed the contact. The phone rang again. The silence of a phone ringing at 2:41 a.m., the specific guilty silence of calling someone in the middle of the night, the silence that says, "What I have to say couldn't wait for morning." His son answered on the third ring. Voice low and thick with sleep, the voice of a man pulled from somewhere deep. "Dad? Is everything okay?" Charles lay on his back in the dark of the 7th floor apartment and held the phone and heard his son's voice, which was his own voice adjusted, his own vocabulary and cadences in a younger register, the voice of someone who had grown up learning how to have a conversation at the surfaces of things, from someone who was very good at it. He said, "Yes, everything is fine. There's something I should tell you." A pause, the particular quality of 2:41 a.m. silence. Then, "Okay." Charles looked at the ceiling. The rain was not falling. The window was dark and wet. The city below was quiet. He said, "I am proud of you." 3 words that had been in the pillow for 30 years, that had been encoded in layers in cotton batting, that had been warm with the heat of not saying for decades, that had pressed against his lips from outside the fabric, with the gentle, persistent pressure of a thing that wanted to be said by the correct method, which was spoken into the actual air of an actual room, to the actual person it was meant for. He said it. His son was quiet for a moment, a long moment, the silence of someone receiving a thing they hadn't known they were waiting for. Then he said, "Dad." "I know, I've always known." And Charles said, "I should have said it out loud." And his son said, "Yeah, you should have." And then they were both quiet, the comfortable quiet of people who have said the true thing and are resting in its aftermath. And outside the 7th floor window, the rainwashed city was doing its pre-dawn business, and the linen closet on the 2nd floor was holding what it held, and the building was breathing in the deep night way of old buildings that have held many lives and will hold many more. Charles said, "It's late, go back to sleep." His son said, "I'm awake now, it's fine." They talked for another 20 minutes, and the conversation had a different quality than their conversations usually had, was less precisely managed, was slightly ragged at the edges in the way that honest things are ragged, and Charles let it be ragged. He did not edit it, he let the language go where it went. When he hung up, he lay still, in the quiet for a moment. Then he put the phone back on the nightstand and closed his eyes. The pillow beneath his head was cooler than it had been all winter. Not ordinary, not yet. 30 years was 30 years, and one night was one night. But the direction was cooler. The direction was toward the ordinary temperature of a pillow that holds only what it was made to hold, which was the weight of a head and the warmth a body generates and offers back to itself in sleep. He closed his eyes. The building held the night around him, held all of them, and the rain had stopped, and the city was quiet, and the closet on the 2nd floor was shut, and somewhere in the building's structure, in the accumulated soft material of 60 years, something that had learned to be patient in the fabric, waited with the quality of a thing that knows it will always have what it needs, because people are built around withholding, and beds are soft, and the dark is private, and the choice between the rain and the pillow will always be a close one. But tonight, in a few apartments at least, the choice had gone toward the rain. The rain had taken what was given. The night moved forward. The light came, and in the morning, in the hallway of the 2nd floor, the linen closet door was closed, and the brass hardware was dark, and the cedar behind the door smelled of the building's long life, and on the 2nd shelf the oldest pillowcase lay folded with its decades of compression, and its warmth that had been constant for longer than most people in this building had been alive. And on the 3rd floor, in the small kitchen apartment with the good window and the coffee always going, Geraldine was awake. She was always awake early. She sat at her kitchen table with her coffee and her view of the street below, and she thought about the building around her, about the people she'd given the information to, and the people she hadn't gotten to yet, about the ones who were following the rule and the ones who weren't, and the ones who were doing something in between that complicated the categories. She thought about the original linen closet on the 2nd floor, about what Priya had told her 6 weeks ago when she'd finally asked about it, about the 2 years of deposits, about the tablecloth, about the line on her face. She thought about the archive, the 60-year compression, the question of whether it could be persuaded to release. She didn't know the answer to this. In 40 years of living in this building and learning its particular mythology from the inside, she had not found an answer to this question. She'd found the rule, had refined the rule through observation and inheritance from the tenants who'd known it before her, had given the rule to the tenants who came after her with the consistency of someone who understood that this was the practical and necessary work, the work of keeping what was manageable, and what was dangerous at the edges of dangerous rather than the centre. But the archive was a different question. She drank her coffee. Below her window, the post-rain street was glistening in the first light. A delivery truck went past, leaving brief parallel reflections in the wet pavement. A woman in a green coat walked her dog around the corner and disappeared. The city was being ordinary in the reliable, continuous way that cities are ordinary in the early morning, without drama or intention, simply proceeding. Geraldine thought, there will be rain again tonight. There usually was this time of year. She thought, I should write the rule down. I have been carrying it in memory for 40 years, and the question of what happens to it when I'm not available to deliver it in person over coffee is a question I've been not asking for long enough that it has the familiar weight of a thing chosen not to be said. She got up from the table. She went to the desk in the corner of the kitchen where she kept her papers and found a yellow legal pad and a good pen. She sat down and wrote at the top of the page in her clear, unhurried hand, "If the pillow gets heavier as you breathe, She wrote the rule down, all of it. The warmth, the letters, the shake, the release, the rain, the distinction between whispering and releasing, the window versus the pillow, the exact quality of the silence that the release required. She wrote it in the plain language of practical information, without mythology, without the supernatural vocabulary, because the supernatural vocabulary was the delivery mechanism, was the narrative coat that the information wore to make it receivable, but the information itself was simpler and more literal, and more important than the delivery mechanism. She wrote it all down. Then she looked at what she'd written for a moment. She added at the bottom, in slightly smaller letters, "What you don't say goes somewhere. The somewhere is the problem. The rule is about the somewhere, about choosing where it goes." She looked at this. Then she added, smaller still, "The rain doesn't mind." She set down the pen. Outside her window, the morning was fully arrived now. The sky lightened to a pale, specific grey. The city below it going about its business with the unremarkable momentum of ordinary days. She could hear the building around her beginning its own morning processes, the distant pipes, the elevator, the sound of the floor above her receiving a person's weight. She thought about the people above and below and on either side, about the 112 of them in their various states of management and restraint and occasional release, about what they were carrying and what they were giving to the fabric and what they were keeping for the weather. She thought it was enough for now that some of them knew. She folded the yellow legal pad in thirds and put it in an envelope. She addressed the envelope in her clear hand to the building. She would put it in the front lobby. She decided. In the common area, beside the recycling information and the utility schedules and the notices from the management company about upcoming maintenance, where people would pick it up out of habit and read it while waiting for the elevator and fold it into their coat pockets and carry it home without quite knowing why. She put her coffee cup in the sink. She picked up the envelope. She went down the hallway and into the stairwell, and down 2 flights to the lobby with the envelope in her hand and the morning light coming in through the lobby windows in long flat planes, and she moved through the light to the bulletin board, and she pinned the envelope there with a single pushpin in the upper left corner, where people would see it. The lobby was empty. The rain had stopped. The city outside the lobby windows was going about its morning. She stood for a moment in the lobby and looked at the envelope on the bulletin board. Then she went back up to her apartment and poured herself more coffee. In apartment 6F, Theo was feeding Pont and watching the morning light shift across the kitchen wall, and the dog ate with the complete and uncritical satisfaction of a dog who has been given his food and is doing the thing he was given his food in order to do. And Theo watched this and thought it was one of the better things about being alive, that dogs are this way about food, that some things are capable of complete uncomplicated engagement with the good thing in front of them. He thought about the pillow. He thought about what had been in it last night and how much of it was still there, and how many nights of sitting up, shaking once, releasing one true thing into the rain, or the rain air, or whatever quality of outside air was available. How many nights of that it would take to bring the pillow to ordinary? He thought. Many. Probably many. He had been holding things for a long time, and the holding had been practiced and thorough, and he was not going to undo it in a week or a month. He was not going to undo it quickly. He thought, that was fine. The direction mattered more than the pace. The direction was out. Pont finished eating, and looked up at him with the grey-muzzled, attentive satisfaction of a dog who has completed a task and is ready for the next one, and Theo looked back at the dog and said, "Good morning." The dog's tail moved once, gravely, in acknowledgement. The morning light shifted on the kitchen wall. In the building around them, people were waking, were making coffee, were showering, were getting ready for the ordinary day, were checking their phones and looking at the weather and thinking about the things they had to do before the night came round again. And the question returned, as it always returned, as it would always return in a building like this one, in a life like any of theirs. The pillow or the rain, the soft private dark, or the actual weather of the actual world, the comfort of keeping, or the work of letting go. The question returned every night. Every night was a new version of the same question, and every night somewhere in the building someone sat up in the dark and shook once and turned toward the window. The rain came when it came. It always came, and it always carried what you gave it, down through the dark city air and into the streets, and from the streets into the water table, and from the water table back into the clouds and back to the sky from which it fell again. And the cycle was longer than the people who used it and did not require their participation and did not require their understanding. It only required the one thing, the window, the breath, the thought released. The rest took care of itself. The rest always had. In the linen closet on the second floor, the oldest pillowcase lay on its cedar shelf in the building's first morning light, warm in the way it was always warm, holding what it held, which was 60 years of the specific weight of what people swallow when they choose, the soft dark over the difficult true. It was very heavy. It had always been very heavy. But this morning, faintly, the way a temperature changes when you introduce a small quantity of something cooler into a large quantity of something warm, barely, incrementally in a way that required careful attention to detect. This morning the oldest pillowcase was perhaps very slightly less heavy than it had been the morning before. The morning came, the building received it. The city outside was wet and glistening and ordinary, and going about its life with the indifferent, continuous momentum of things that do not wait to be understood before they proceed. The light moved across the walls. The day began. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The rain came in sideways that night, the way it only does in October, when the season turns mean and starts showing its teeth. Marcus Hale stood on the 8th floor balcony of the Vanthorpe apartment complex in socks that had gone dark and wet at the toes the second he stepped outside, and he didn't care. He barely noticed. The cold of the railing went into his palms like a current, like the metal was pulling something out of him through the skin, and he let it. He'd been standing there for 40 minutes rehearsing the same conversation he'd failed to have for 3 months. "Elena, I'm not in love with you anymore." 6 words. He'd counted them. He had variations, 7 words, 9 words, whole paragraphs that softened the landing or explained the drift. But they all meant the same 6 words, and he hadn't said any of them because the moment he said them out loud, the future would stop being theoretical and start being real. Real meant consequences. Real meant her face doing that thing. It did when she was about to cry but was fighting it, the way her jaw tightened and her eyelashes went dark. Real meant boxes and lease agreements, and the specific misery of dividing the kitchen, deciding who got the good cutting board, who got the cast iron pan they'd bought together at a farmer's market when they were still the kind of people who went to farmers' markets together on Sunday mornings. So instead of saying it, he came out here. He'd been coming out here for weeks. The courtyard below him shimmered. The lights mounted on the exterior walls scattered pale gold across the wet pavement, and the light broke apart in the puddles into coins and ribbons. A drain gurgled somewhere. Marcus stared at the puddles and felt the specific exhaustion of someone who has been almost deciding for too long. The way it hollows you out, how you start to feel less like a person and more like a recording of a person, looping the same 12 seconds of almost action before the tape snaps back to the beginning. He adjusted his grip. The railing was slick and he moved his right hand 4 inches to the left, the way you do when you're settling in, getting comfortable in an uncomfortable place. He exhaled through his nose and watched the vapour of his breath dissipate in the rain. Then he saw the handprint. It was 4 feet to his left, a clear palm impression in the thin sheen of rain that coated the railing, 5 fingers and the pad of a hand pressed flat. The kind you leave when you grip something wet with force. Marcus stared at it because it shouldn't have been there. He hadn't moved his hands. He'd adjusted his right hand to the left, yes, but only a few inches, nowhere near that print. He looked at his own hands on the railing, looked at the print, looked at his hands again. He thought, someone else was out here before me. Someone came out, stood in approximately the same spot and went back inside. That's all. Rain does strange things, water pooled, the surface tension, held the impression longer than expected. He'd seen water do weird things. He was tired, he was cold. He'd been standing out here in October rain in wet socks, rehearsing a breakup speech for 40 minutes, and his brain was doing what overtaxed, under-rested brains do, which is find patterns and then add meaning to them that isn't there. He looked back at the print. It hadn't faded. If anything, it looked fresher, the edges sharper, the surface tension around the depression more defined, as though it had just been made. And now that he was really looking, really measuring it with his eyes, he could see that the print was the exact same size as his hand. Not approximately, not close, the same. The same wide palm, the same spread of fingers, the same slight irregularity in the pinky that turned outward, because he'd broken it once in college falling off a fire escape, and it had healed at a 4-degree angle, and that slight crookedness was there in the print 4 feet to his left on a railing he hadn't touched. Marcus lifted his right hand from the rail and pressed it down. His print appeared exactly where he pressed, the rain sheen compressing under his palm, the impression filling. 3 feet further to his left, a second print appeared. Not beneath his hand, not where he'd pressed. 3 feet further along, as though his next move had already been recorded by something with better information than him about where he was going. The rain intensified for a moment, one of those sudden upsurges that last about 4 seconds before settling back into steady drizzle. And in that brief pounding, Marcus heard a sound that didn't belong. Not loud, not dramatic, just wrong. A sound like someone shifting their weight on metal, the faint groan of a balcony railing under pressure, the sound of someone leaning, and it was coming from beside him. Marcus turned. The balcony was empty. It was always empty. It was his balcony, attached to his apartment, 7 feet wide and 4 feet deep, and containing one rusted outdoor chair that Elena had bought at a garage sale 2 years ago, and which Marcus hadn't sat in since June. The rain fell on the chair and on the painted concrete and on the doormat and on him, and on nothing else, because there was nothing else there. But the sound came again, that metallic settle, that shifting under weight, and Marcus watched the rail to his left depress very slightly, then hold, like something was leaning on it that had no business leaning on it, like something with the weight of a person was applying pressure to a section of railing 3 feet from his hands, and the metal was responding the way metal responds to weight, with that minor compression, that tiny give. Marcus's hands went white on the rail. He wasn't superstitious. He had a degree in civil engineering. He understood load distribution, structural tolerances, the physics of pressure and deformation. He also understood that the railing 3 feet to his left was currently behaving as though something was pressing down on it from above, and that there was nothing there to press, and that the handprint beside the depression point was still fresh and still curved, and still had a crooked pinky. The second silhouette came without drama. He didn't notice it at first because it appeared the way things appear when you're looking at something else, peripherally, slowly, by degrees. He was staring at the depressed section of railing. Then he was staring at the wet metal of the railing closer to him, where his reflection stretched and broke across the moisture, his face distorted into something longer and paler than his actual face. Then he became aware that the distorted reflection had company. It was beside his own reflection, taller, thinner, made of less, the way a curtain is less than a wall, present but permeable, something you could see through if the light was right. It was leaning in the posture he'd been leaning in, forearms down, weight, forward, that slight forward lean that he'd been holding for 40 minutes. But the reflection was a half-second behind. He moved slightly, adjusted his shoulder, the small involuntary shift, and the curtain thing in the reflection stayed in his previous position for that half-beat too long, as though it was running on a delay, or as though it was remembering rather than seeing. It knew how he leaned. It knew his weight distribution. It knew the specific angle of someone who's been standing in one place too long doing nothing. Marcus straightened up fast and said, out loud to the empty rain, "What the—" The word died, because the handprints ahead of him were multiplying, not fast, not in a rush. With a terrible patience, each one appearing a second after the last, spaced like steps, like the railing was laying out a path along its length, 5 feet to his left, 6 feet, 7, moving toward the corner of the building where the balcony turned and the railing continued around, the side and where Marcus always went when he needed to think hardest, because you could see more of the city from there. The view opened up, you could see 3 blocks in each direction, and he always ended up there without deciding to go there. He just always found himself at that corner eventually. The prints were walking there without him. He thought about going inside. The thought was clear and available. He formed it completely, turn around, slide open the glass door, step into the apartment, take off the wet socks, make tea, and then did nothing with it. His hands stayed on the rail, his feet didn't move. The thought of going inside existed in his head as a complete available option, and his body simply refused to follow through on it, the way his body had been refusing to follow through on things for months. He was very good at forming intentions and very bad at having them translate into action. That was the whole problem. That was what he was out here about. The Prince reached the corner and stopped, waited. All 6 or 7 of them, a path of his own hands laid out along the railing in the rain, patient as trail markers. Marcus walked toward them. He wasn't sure when he started moving. One moment he was standing still, and then he was walking left along the railing, following the path. Because of course he was, because where else was he going to go? Because his body apparently needed to be led somewhere, and the building was doing it now. So fine, let the building do it. At least something was making a decision. At least something knew where to go and was willing to go there. He reached the corner, put his hands in the fresh prints waiting for him. They fit exactly. Every line, every crook, the 4-degree angle of the broken pinky, and the fit felt like recognition, like shaking hands with yourself. And that was when the cold went from skin deep to bone deep. The kind of cold that doesn't come from weather. He looked down at the courtyard from the corner, and the view was exactly as it always was. The pale lights, the trembling puddles, the drain that never stopped gurgling. 8 stories down, the wet pavement shining. The curtain shape in the reflection at the corner was sharper. He could see it clearly now in the wet rail, longer and thinner than him, but arranged in perfect imitation of his posture. Forearms down, weight forward, and its face, if it had a face, was where his face would be if he leaned just a few more inches, just a few degrees further forward than he currently was. It was practicing him. That was the word that arrived. Practicing. Like an understudy who has been watching from the wings for too long and has begun to believe they know the part better than the original. Every lean he'd ever done out here. Every grip. Every long, still pause in the rain. The thing had been watching and learning, and now it could do him better than he was doing himself. It had more commitment to the performance. It wasn't held back by the uncertainty and the fear. It just did the lean. It just held the position. It didn't hesitate. In the wet metal surface of the corner railing, the curtain shape leaned forward a few degrees. Just enough. Marcus wrenched his hands off the railing and took 3 steps back and stood in the middle of the balcony in the rain with his hands held in front of him. Fingers spread, like he needed to prove they were his, like he needed to see them not touching anything. His chest heaved. The rain fell on his upturned face. He'd moved without deciding to move, for once, and the surprise of it felt almost like relief. He placed both hands flat on his chest. He didn't know why. Something in him just needed to feel his own ribcage, needed to locate himself, needed contact with something that was unambiguously his own body. His palms pressed flat over his sternum, and he felt the heat there against the cold of his hands, the warmth of himself, and under that the pulse. Steady. Faster than normal. His. He breathed. Rain came down. The corner railing stood empty. "I'm allowed to be scared and still be honest." The sentence arrived not as something he composed, but as something he found. The way you find your wallet in a pocket you didn't think to check. It was there, and it was true, and it was small enough to actually mean something. Not a resolution, not a vow. Just a sentence he could live inside for the next 12 hours. He could be scared. He was scared. He was terrified of Elena's face, terrified of the boxes, terrified of the cutting board conversation. And he could still tell the truth, and these two things did not cancel each other out. He kept his hands on his chest, kept breathing, watched the corner. The prints on the railing faded slowly, the rain smoothing them out and washing them flat, until the metal was just metal again, cold and ordinary, holding nothing, remembering nothing. The distortion in the reflection settled into just distortion. The lean in the courtyard light was just the lean of the light. The sound of weight on metal stopped. Marcus stood alone on the balcony in wet socks and October rain, and didn't need to grip anything. He thought, "I'll tell her tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight." He'd wake her if he had to. He'd sit on the edge of the bed and say the 6 words in whatever order they came out, and then he'd sit with the consequence of that, and not run back to the railing to rehearse his way through the next part. He went back inside. The couple in 4F had been fighting for 11 days without resolution. You could hear it through the walls if you pressed your ear to the plaster, which the woman in 4E had stopped doing because she was tired of being the audience to someone else's endless circling argument about the same 5 grievances repackaged in slightly different language each time. Her name was Petra Voss, and she was 39, and she had her own balcony and her own thoughts about saying hard things, and she preferred to take them outside where they got cold and quiet rather than inside where they got hot and complicated. She stepped out at 2 a.m. with a glass of red wine she wasn't going to drink, and stood at the railing on the 4th floor and looked at the courtyard below and the rain that was still falling. It had been raining for 6 hours now, steady and patient, and she thought about the thing she'd been not saying for 4 months. which was not a breakup speech, but something in some ways harder because it was about her own failures rather than someone else's. She owed her sister a phone call. Not just a phone call, an accounting. An honest conversation about the money she'd borrowed and not repaid and not mentioned for 14 months, because every time she picked up the phone she thought, I'll explain when I have something more to show for it. I'll call when I can offer something alongside the apology. I'll say something when the saying doesn't feel like pure exposure. And so 14 months had passed and the borrowed money sat between them like a body nobody was naming. Petra sipped the wine and didn't taste it and leaned on the rail. The prints appeared faster for her. Maybe because it was later, or maybe because she'd been standing there longer than she realised. She was 40 minutes in before she noticed them. She was a deeper postponer than Marcus Hale upstairs, more practised, more committed to the tomorrow logic, and when she noticed them they'd already been there for a while. A chain of palm impressions stretching leftward along the rail, her exact hand, her exact span, leading away from her toward the section of balcony she always ended up at when the problem felt biggest, which was the far right where the drain pipe ran down the building's exterior, and she could hear the rain moving through it, a sound like something urgently travelling, and she found the urgency of it somehow comforting, the idea of water going somewhere, without hesitation,